Good evening, everyone. I'm sports psychologist Dr. Andrew Jacobs. I'm the host of the Sports Psychology Hour radio show here in Kansas City. It airs every Sunday morning from 7 to 8 a.m. Central Time. And welcome to our live stream event. Over the past few years, in addition to my radio show, which I've had for 33 years, we've now launched the Sports Psychology Hour as a podcast and now via live stream. I've got plenty of episodes for you to listen to if you go to my website, winnersunlimited.com, click on the podcast page there, where you can listen to episodes of the show. I'm in my 43rd year of work as a sports psychologist here in the United States in Kansas City. And obviously, Kansas City, we're all excited about the Super Bowl this weekend. So everybody's pretty pumped up about that. And in fact, in my radio show this coming Sunday, I'm going to be interviewing Al Saunders, one of the greatest coaches in American football history. He's coached for over almost 40 years, including a Super Bowl champion with the St. Louis Rams. So be sure if you're interested to listen to the show. It will be 7 to 8 a.m. this Sunday morning, Super Bowl Sunday. And yet, now we're doing a whole series of conversations focusing on coaches and athletes. And I'm really excited tonight because we're talking with Lydia Black, who is a psychologist in Australia. First time I've had the privilege to talk with Lydia, and especially somebody in Australia live on our show. So Lydia, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really look forward to talking with you about sports psychology and mindsets and attitudes and athletes. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really lovely to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your background and what you do, because everybody in the sports psychology realm comes from different perspectives, different backgrounds, does different things. So tell us what you do down in Australia.
Sure. Well, as you say, there's lots of different ways into the world of sports psychology, and in Australia, that's the case here in Australia. My background was actually I was a young kid once upon a time, many, many, many years ago, and I was terrible at ball sports and decided to give a shot at at rowing or crew, as you guys refer to it, because I was tall. And so someone said, come on, you be good, hop in a boat, and off I went. And I had many years rowing in Australia. I eventually rowed for Australia when I was about 17, 18 years old. But my journey to that point was pretty rocky in terms of my own experience with performance anxiety and struggles with some of the coaching approaches back then, which were, pretty much just be mentally tough, get out there and do what you got to do.
Did you have male or female coaches?
Male at that stage. Yeah. Very dedicated, amazing volunteers in the space of club rowing, but also very hell-bent on success and developing a team, developing a squad of young athletes who were headed, we thought at the time, to the 2000 Olympics. So my journey then, I got to the age of 18 and was feeling a bit burnt out and a bit over the rowing scene in Australia, and decided that I was going to quit. And my mum said, hang on a second, there's some scholarships here in America where you could go and study and go to university and continue with your rowing in a very different environment. And so I applied. Long story short, I got accepted to Northeastern University in Boston. And I had an amazing experience there for 5 years it's a 5-year university, as some of your listeners would be aware, with a co-op program. And it was an amazing experience where I started my undergraduate degree in psychology. And then on returning, and an interesting note, whilst I was in the States, was part of the very first ever NCAA women's champs in rowing, because it didn't exist prior to, I'm thinking 1998, maybe? I'm not sure on my dates exactly, but somewhere around there. And so then I returned to Australia, picked up some part-time work, became an admin assistant for a real estate agent. Terribly boring, horribly awful. Decided to do my master's in psychology, which I did, and then went and worked first of all in some educational settings as a school psychologist. So I had a really lovely experience there over about 5 or 6 years working in schools. Travelled to Indonesia to work at an Australian international school over there, and had a bit to do with some athletes there that just kind of stumbled in my door by accident. And then on returning to Australia, worked in private practice and in schools again, and again worked with a few athletes kind of accidentally, but mostly sort of started working more in a clinical with a clinical focus, until again, a few more athletes stumbled in the door. And I met a young rower who reminded me very much of myself, reminded me of the struggles I'd been having as a young person. And so I thought I could use some of this clinical knowledge that I have around supporting people with anxiety to assist some athletes. And had just at the time sort of dived into the world of acceptance and commitment therapy, which I'm sure you're aware of, and figured it could be applied in some degree to the world of sport. And so continued to see more athletes and gained some more professional knowledge, and then started working at the Tasmanian Institute of Sport on a contract basis for supporting athletes there. And then now I work as a contractor for the Australian Institute of Sport, supporting athletes through the mental health referral network. So that's in regards to mental health struggles. And obviously sometimes that also includes performance struggles, because it's very hard to separate the two, as I'm sure you're aware. And now I work sort of in my private practice with a range of clients, from grassroots athletes right through to elite sort of Olympic athletes, and some within professional teams as well. And just love the sports psychology world. I'm very passionate about educating others and educating coaches about the impact of sports psychology and the issues around mental health in sport. And I'm very passionate about helping young athletes get access to sort of affordable, easy to access support in regards to their mental health struggles related to sport. So that's a very long answer. I hope that covers it all.
That was excellent. And I always like to find out everybody's background. I mean, everybody's different who's gotten involved in this profession. When I started, nobody had heard of it before. So it's always interesting now to hear younger people like yourself. Two things popped up in my mind as I was listening to you describe your background. One is coaches, and the other is the whole mental health aspect. So one of the things, I've co-authored a book here called Just Let Them Play, Guiding Parents, Coaches, and Athletes Through Youth Sports, with an Olympic Hall of Fame swim coach and a Major League Baseball all-star. And one of the things we came up with writing the book, the reason for it was because of all the abuse that coaches seem to deal on kids with. And it's still an issue here in the United States. And listening to you, I'm sure you had to deal with some of that yourself in some degrees, especially being as a woman being coached by men. So yeah. I'd like to get your perspective on coaches and what you see as the negative types of coaching that goes on, and how do we address that and correct that? And then the other side of it, what's the positive side of coaching that you see?
Sure.
It's a great question.
No, it's a great question. And actually, I mean, before I jump into the answer, for the past 6 years, I've coached my daughter's soccer team, and she started at the age of under 5. And the reason I jumped into that role, I had no knowledge of soccer, none at all. And the reason I jumped into that role was because I was so passionate about ensuring that young girls in particular have access to coaches who are ensuring that the focus is on a holistic approach to coaching, in terms of making sure it's an activity that's engaging, fun, looking after them as young people developing right across the spectrum, rather than just in regards to performance. So to answer your question probably more directly, I think the really unhelpful thing when it comes to some coaches is when it's about their egos. I think if a coach is coaching for the wrong reasons, they're coaching because they want success, as opposed to they want to be a part of a sport, and they want to develop young people, or help young people develop into the best that they can be in the world of their sport, but also holistically across the board.
Interesting you say that on the other side of the world from me, because one of my favorite sayings is a good coach checks his or her ego at the door. It's not about them, it's about the athletes. You know,
absolutely. I wholeheartly agree.
And I've seen throughout my career so much coach abuse, from young kids all the way up to professional athletes. You know, I had a conversation with a great NFL football coach the other day, and we were talking about coaching because he coached the right way. And we talked about an article I read several years ago about the Seattle Seahawks football team, and their coach at the time, who just was let go, Pete Carroll. He hired the former Oakland Raiders head coach, to coach the offensive line. And after a few months of being there, this individual was interviewed and said, I didn't realize I've been coaching the wrong way my whole career because I was yelling and screaming at people and I didn't listen to them. Now I learned here, listen first and then talk, but don't scream, listen. And that's
Mm.
I think you hit it on the head. So many coaches' egos get caught up with winning and the notoriety and all that. Even with 8-year-old, 7-year-old kids playing, they start to get all caught up. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, 100%. I think that there's a really dangerous stage between youth sport and elite sport. There's a space in there where people are not, I mean, it happens right across the board, but I think in that particular time frame there, or that stage of development, those coaches are particularly they're great with their time. They're volunteering. They're giving lots of time to the sport, which is fantastic. So they're needed in the sport, but they're not very well educated, and there's no checks to ensure that they are gaining access to professional development or gaining access to coaching support, mentorship, or anything like that, which would be so helpful. They're going with what they know, and often they're going with how they were coached. And unless we can break that cycle and ensure that those coaches in that, particularly in that place, but all right across the board, can gain access to more information and are better educated, that problem's going to continue
Well,
because it's a
I'm going to throw in a plug for myself here with my book, which was called "The Bible of Youth Sports" by the head of Mojo Sports here in the United States. He said every parent, every coach should read it because we talked about the whole issue here, and that's in fact our fourth chapter is embracing failure can lead to fun, because you have to learn how to fail. And I think when you have so many of these coaches at the youth sport level, they get caught up with the winning and the results, and their egos, like you said, get in the way. And what happens is then these kids get hurt. And that's where I think there needs to be, in addition to training someone on how to, coach kids how to pass a ball or shoot a ball, they need to be coached about how to talk to kids, how to compliment them, how to discipline them at the same time. There's got to be a balance with that. Don't you agree?
absolutely 100%. And I think being aware of the culture within a team or within a coach athlete dynamic is very important, and that culture needs to be a part of the training focus. That needs to be a part of the conversation, as opposed to just being about the technical strengths of the athlete or the physical strengths of the athlete and the coach. It needs to be about the collaboration and the relationship.
Have you ever had a situation where you've maybe had a coach in your office or talked to a team with a coach who was not treating the athletes properly, and how did you handle that?
Absolutely. And I think the real shame of the matter is a lot of these coaches, as I alluded to before, are just operating out of a default setting. They are going back to what they know. And and this has to be done so carefully and so sensitively, but when a coach can be educated about the other way and seeing the other way of coaching and the benefits that come from that, as well as the benefits that come from the relationship that they have with the athletes and the enjoyment they can get from the sport. But I think education is the key. And I think the really sad thing is when that conversation doesn't happen, and a coach can be vilified. A coach can end up with a bad reputation, or a club can end up with a bad reputation. And actually what it comes down to is that cycle of tradition passing on, rather than, someone actually needs to step in and say, there's another way to do this. And then, of course, a person has to be open enough to hear that information and to take it on board, which is not easy. And I
And does
myself,
it,
as a
sorry, go
female
ahead.
psychologist, as a female psychologist who hasn't worked with any big team, so I haven't got a lot of credibility in that regard because I've come from the clinical space, I find that conversation quite hard.
It's been interesting for me. My sons are now in their 30s, but when both of them played several sports growing up, and I witnessed so much abuse. And one story I always like to share was when my youngest son Gregory was playing baseball. He was, I believe, 11 or 12 at the time, and we were going to play the next game. and the team in front of us was from our same neighborhood. It was playing. One of the young men got to second base, and the third base coach is saying, "Steal, come on, steal third." So he took 3 steps and fell flat in his face. The coach in the dugout turned around, and he was probably 5 feet in front of me, kicked the fence. The bats and the helmets fell off the bat rack. He slammed his hat down on the ground. The young man comes in the dugout. He grabbed him by his neck, threw him against the fence. Which point I said, "Hey, I said something to him, and he had a few expletives for me." And then the first base coach came in and grabbed me and goes, "What are you doing?" And the boy now is on the ground crying. I went over and got his dad, who wasn't even paying attention because his dad just came to the games to socialize. The long and short of it is that young man, when he was a sophomore in high school, came in to see me with his dad and said, "I've never recovered from that situation." And I
No.
reported that coach, and they did tell him he couldn't coach anymore, thankfully. But
Mm.
like, why would you do that? I mean, so that's where I think coaches need to be trained on the communication that they have with kids, the behavior they have with kids, and like we started off here with their own egos. And so you see the same thing in Australia that we see here in the United States.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, definitely. And that bleeds into a bigger conversation, doesn't it? That we probably don't have time for today around, I mean, that coach is probably also a parent, and how's he treating his own children, and how do we,
Yes,
that's
exactly. Exactly. You
a
wonder.
conversation around discipline and all sorts of things, and parenting, which, because of my background, I have a lot of information to share on that, but don't get me started, I won't stop.
No, I'm thoroughly enjoying our conversation here because it's great to talk to somebody literally on the other side of the world who
Yeah.
who is in the same mindset. So let me ask this question. You're obviously a woman with young girls today, with involvement in sports, with swimming, gymnastics, soccer, softball, all these different sports. What do you see some of the issues for young girls, maybe a little bit different than young boys?
Again, that's a question that could go on the answer could go on for a very long time, because I think it's multifaceted. But I think the main factor that stands out to me is that many of the sports are aesthetic sports that you've mentioned there. And so therefore there's a focus on not just how they do their sport, but how they look whilst they're doing their sport. And in some of those sports, they're actually graded or scored on their body, on their physical appearance. And so, in the world that we live in, when there's already a massive focus on that in terms of social media and the general media, and just girls being girls, caring about how they present, it's a very dangerous space for those athletes to walk that tightrope between doing what I need to do for my sport whilst keeping my mental health in check, and a realistic and healthy perspective on who I am and how my body changes over time, how my body changes whilst being an athlete, and weighing that up with all the social pressures. I think that's probably the biggest concern I see for young girls these days.
So what do you do as a therapist to work with someone on that who maybe comes into your office with an issue like that?
So the focus that I take in my therapeutic practice is very much about values. So very much about why and who are you? How do you want to behave, as opposed to what do you want to achieve? And so that comes back to being able to help an athlete understand the reasons behind their involvement in the sport. What matters to you most when you get up there on the beam in gymnastics, or what matters to you most when it comes to being a part of your team, and being able to help that athlete get right down to the nitty-gritty about their reasoning behind sport, other than winning, other than looking good, other than having a nicely shaped body. Being able to help them understand that there are so many other reasons for being out there, and that stuff actually matters more. The way we behave as opposed to what we achieve is what I tend to focus on. And then when I'm working with coaches around that issue, or parents, I like to try and help them, and the athlete themselves, I like them to try and help them adapt their language to discussing what their body can do, as opposed to how their body looks whilst doing it. And that comes right back. That can be right at grassroots level in terms of the very young gymnast, or even at a more professional level when we have coaches selecting athletes based on how they look for, say, a hockey team, because that person looks better for they look like they're more athletic, they look like they're going to go further. So being able to come back to assessing an athlete's capacity to perform and what their body can do as opposed to how their body looks.
As we grow in the field of sports psychology, and we see more and more awareness and need for people to work with athletes on not just the performance enhancement side, but on the personal development side, whether it's issues with self-esteem, body concepts, whatever it might be, relationships that aren't sport related, but they're individual related. I've talked about this forever on my radio show. Athletes are people. Yes, they may be physically superior than most of us, but they still have the same emotions, the same feelings as the rest of us do, and they have to learn to deal with it. And so,
Definitely.
and so, the one of the big issues that I see is a lack of education on developing who they are. I think a lot of elite level athletes get to that point because of their superiority physically and psychologically as well. But a lot of the times they don't know how to deal with pressure situations outside the court. And that's where I think the importance of someone trained in psychology and mental health is so important and necessary for teams. And I know I was one of the very first sports psychologists in the United States. I was the first sports psychologist at the University of Kansas. I was one of the very first sports psychologists in Major League Baseball at the Kansas City Royals. And I know throughout my career, there have always been, I currently work with the NWSL team, our Kansas City current women's professional soccer team. And the NWSL now has a requirement that all teams have a mental health professional on staff, which to me is awesome. But I think that needs to be carried down, not just the professional level, but to the collegiate and educational levels as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's imperative. And we have a massive lack of professionals in Australia at the moment. We have a real skill shortage in terms of those professional roles. And it's a shame because not many athletes actually have access to sports psychology unless it's paid for by, if they're part of an institution or, they're part of a club that has that kind of money, but not every club does. Actually, that's part of the reason and this is a plug, I hope you don't mind me throwing it in there, I've developed an online course for young people with struggling with anxiety. And it's a focus on, it's called Accept to Excel. And you can find it on my website, which hopefully there'll be some show notes or something that people can access. But my focus behind that has been about helping people understand what's driving their performance anxiety, but it really goes beyond that because it taught in my course, I help people to really examine why are they doing what they're doing, what matters to them other than winning, and helping them to have that sort of really holistic focus on their well-being so that they can step outside of their sport and cope. Or, if there is a setback, if they're injured or if they have to transition out of their sport, they have a broader sense of who they are. So the focus is on their performance anxiety, but it's also on helping them to develop a broader sense of who they are and why they're doing what they're doing.
Let me ask you a question there in relationship to that, because that's something I work with so many young people on. I think that, as I said in our book, our chapter, embracing failure can lead to fun. Because I think it's important that we teach young athletes that failing is okay. It's part of life. It's part of sport. And to educate, I mean, it's not fun. I hate losing at anything. I mean, I'm in Kansas City. I want the Chiefs to win the Super Bowl this weekend. Players. I mean, I'm really into it. I went to the very first Super Bowl in 1967. I've been a fan my whole life. And as a professional, I've worked with over 30 Kansas City Chiefs players privately. So I want the team to win. But one player I work with right now, he plays on another team. Wonderful man. He's got anxiety issues. And the anxiety started from when he was younger and developed, but because he was such a great athlete, people just, ignored that. And now he's finally dealing with it. They, oh, you don't need to deal with that. You're a tough guy. Well, he's a person. So I think, especially with younger athletes, teaching them about losing, failing, screwing up, making mistakes, that it's okay, I think can help build the confidence so that when they do get older, that they don't develop a lot of these issues. What's your thought on that?
Absolutely. And, I'm always talking to my clients about normalizing anxiety. When someone comes in and says, "Oh, I think I have anxiety," I'm like, yes, of course you do. We all do. We all have
Get it from
anxiety. Absolutely. It's a primitive function that keeps us alive. It stops us from doing dumb things. It stops us from, stepping off a cliff. So that anxiety is a big part of being human, and it's a really functional, response. When it gets in the way of you being able to do what you're passionate about, of course, then it's helpful to have some strategies for making sure it doesn't take over. But you can also learn to embrace it, and teaching young people to embrace the energy that comes from nerves so that they can put it into their performance. That's another really powerful way of turning it around, because then they can see it as fuel for what they're doing. And like you say, you teach them at a young age, they've got that skill for life.
And that's where I believe, sort of as we wrap our conversation up tonight, that's where
Oh,
educating coaches is so important on the psychological and mental aspects of sport, of winning and losing, success and failure, and that it's okay to lose and fail because we're all going to do it. Not that you want to do it, but
no.
when I say it's okay, it's part of life. So that how you learn, instead of being scared of it, like we said, if you embrace it, it's something I'm going to grow and learn from. You're going to get a lot better. I work with a very prominent NFL kicker who has had to learn to deal with that, and he's overcome that and done very well with it because he's not scared to fail. He's
Yeah.
focused on success, and
Yep.
when he has failed, instead of falling apart, he looks at what happened and grows from that and gets better. And so that's to me a big part of this whole process of developing young athletes.
Definitely. And I tend to say to people, expect and accept. Expect that you will fail. Accept that it's a normal part of what you do as an athlete. Expect your anxiety. Accept that it's a normal part of doing something that you really care about. So expect it and accept it, because then you're not freaking out when it happens or feeling like a failure when it happens.
Well, Lydia, this has been fabulous talking with you tonight. We could talk for probably 5 or 6 hours, but
I'm sure we could.
you probably got to go to work, and at some point I got to go to bed. But I want to thank you so much. If people like to get a hold of you, how can they reach you? Because I have a lot of people listening to our broadcast. How can they get a hold of you?
Sure. So my website is focusedpsych.org. So that's focusedpsch.org. And you
Got a
can
name
find my
spelling. That's good.
yeah, you can find my contact info on there, focuspsych.org.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been a fabulous interview. I'd love to talk to you again. I think we have a lot in common,
Great.
and
That'd
it's
be
great to
great.
talk. It's great to talk to someone, on the other side of the world. But B, to talk to somebody who understands what's going on, and I'm sure you're helping a lot of athletes. So I really appreciate it for you joining us
Thank you.
tonight. You know,
Thank you
if you,
so much.
you're welcome. You're welcome. If you've enjoyed our conversation tonight, once again, go to my website, winnersunlimited.com, click on the podcast tab. You can hear dozens and dozens of podcast episodes we've had in the past. And this will be one of the highly listened to ones. I know, Lydia, this is great. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.